Have you ever been in a room where you felt like you absolutely didn't belong? Where every person seemed to fit a mold that you were never designed for? I want to know where you're watching from tonight, because I bet wherever you are, you felt that sting of not measuring up to someone else's narrow idea of perfection. Sofia Martinez stood at the edge of the Meridian Hotel's grand ballroom, her stomach twisting as she watched perfectly polished people network with the kind of effortless confidence she'd never possessed. At 28, she should have felt more secure in her own skin, but 3 days ago her boss had made it crystal clear that her curves didn't fit the sleek image he wanted representing his marketing firm. "Your aesthetic doesn't align with our brand vision," he'd said, as if her body was a logo that needed redesigning. Now she was here because her friend Maya had insisted that freelance graphic designers needed to network, even when they felt like imposters in rooms full of size 2 women wearing designer dresses that cost more than Sofia's monthly rent. She tugged at the hem of her black cocktail dress, the one Maya had sworn made her look stunning. Though standing here among Manhattan's elite, Sofia felt anything but stunning. The ballroom buzzed with conversation punctuated by the clink of champagne glasses and occasional laughter. Sofia recognized several faces from business magazines and social media, the kind of people who ran empires and dated models. She definitely didn't belong here, but Maya had been right about one thing. She needed clients if she wanted to keep eating. She was reaching for her phone to text Maya an excuse to leave when she noticed the man across the room. He stood near the bar with 3 other men, but he commanded attention in a way that made the others seem like background noise. Tall, probably 6'2", with dark hair styled perfectly and olive skin that suggested Mediterranean heritage. His suit was clearly custom, the kind of tailored perfection that whispered wealth rather than shouting it. But it was his presence that caught her attention, the way other people seemed to unconsciously create space around him, as if recognizing some invisible authority. Sofia found herself studying the sharp line of his jaw, the confident way he held himself, the intensity in his dark eyes as he listened to whatever one of his companions was saying. He was probably in his mid-30s, and everything about him screamed power and control. Stop staring, she told herself. Men like that didn't notice women like her, and she was fine with that. More than fine. The last thing she needed was another reminder that she wasn't anyone's ideal. She was turning toward the exit when the first gunshot cracked through the ballroom. Time seemed to fracture into sharp, disconnected moments. A woman screamed. Champagne glasses shattered as people dove for cover. Sofia's mind couldn't process what was happening fast enough, her body frozen in shock as chaos erupted around her. 2 men in dark suits had appeared near the entrance, weapons drawn, and aimed at a silver-haired businessman who'd been giving a speech moments earlier. The businessman stumbled backward, crimson spreading across his white shirt as security personnel shouted orders no one could hear over the screaming. "Move," Sofia's brain finally commanded her legs. She dropped to her knees behind a cocktail table, her heart hammering so hard she could feel it in her throat. This wasn't real. This couldn't be real. People didn't get shot at networking events in 5-star hotels. The gunmen were scanning the crowd now, their weapons tracking from person to person like they were hunting for additional targets. Sofia realized with cold terror that she'd seen their faces clearly, that she was a witness to whatever had just happened. One of them pointed directly at her. Before she could move, before she could even think, strong hands grabbed her shoulders and hauled her upright. She found herself pressed against a hard chest, looking up into intense dark eyes that belonged to the man she'd been watching earlier. "Stay down and follow me," he said, his voice carrying absolute authority despite being barely above a whisper. His accent held a hint of something European, Italian maybe, and his grip on her arm was firm enough to leave no room for argument. He guided her toward a service in trance she hadn't noticed, moving with purpose while keeping his body positioned between her and the gunman. Sofia's legs felt unsteady, but his hand on her elbow kept her moving forward even as her mind struggled to catch up with what was happening. Behind them, she could hear more gunshots, more screaming, the sharp commands of what sounded like police or security forces arriving. The man beside her didn't look back, didn't hesitate, just kept moving with the kind of calm efficiency that suggested this wasn't his first crisis. They reached the service door, and he pushed it open, revealing a narrow hallway lined with industrial equipment. The sounds of chaos faded slightly as the door closed behind them, though Sophia could still hear sirens growing louder outside the building. The man released her arm and turned to face her fully for the first time. Up close, he was even more striking than she'd realized, with sharp cheekbones and a mouth that looked like it rarely smiled. His dark eyes assessed her quickly, professionally, taking in everything from her face to her shoes in a way that felt almost clinical. "Did you see the shooters clearly?" he asked. Sophia nodded, still too shocked to find her voice. Her hands were shaking, she realized, trembling like leaves in a storm. "That's unfortunate," he said, though his tone suggested it was unfortunate for her rather than for him. "They'll want to eliminate witnesses. You can't go home tonight." "What?" Sophia finally managed to speak, though her voice came out as little more than a whisper. "I don't understand what's happening. Who are you?" "Marco Torino." His name meant nothing to her, but the way he said it suggested it should. "And you just witnessed the assassination of Vincent Castellano, which means you're now a target." "A target?" Sophia felt like she was drowning in information she couldn't process. This morning her biggest worry had been finding new clients. Now a stranger was telling her people wanted to kill her for being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Marco was already moving again, leading her down the hallway toward what looked like a freight elevator. His phone buzzed, and he answered it without breaking stride. "Yes," he said into the phone. "I have the witness. Heading to location 7 now." "Witness?" Sophia stopped walking, fear finally overriding shock. "Wait, I need to call the police. I need to report what I saw." Marco turned back to her, and for the first time she saw something that might have been amusement flicker across his features. "The police are already here, and reporting what you saw would be signing your death warrant. The people who killed Castellano have resources most law enforcement agencies only dream of." The elevator arrived with a soft ding, and Marco stepped inside, holding the door open for her. Sophia hesitated, every instinct telling her not to trust a stranger, no matter how compelling his presence or how logical his words sounded. "You can come with me and live through the night, or you can stay here and hope the police can protect you better than they protected Castellano." His tone was matter-of-fact, without pressure or persuasion. "Your choice." Looking at him, Sophia realized she was trapped between two impossible options: trust a man she didn't know, or face killers who wanted her dead. Neither choice felt safe, but only one offered the possibility of survival. She stepped into the elevator. As the doors closed, Marco studied her again with that same clinical assessment, his gaze traveling from her face down to her body in a way that made her suddenly aware of every curve, every imperfection she'd been self-conscious about all evening. "This complicates things," he said, almost to himself. "I don't typically protect civilians, especially not ones who look like they'd rather be anywhere else." "I was trying to leave when the shooting started," Sophia said, defensive despite everything. "Good instincts. Unfortunately, leaving isn't an option anymore." The elevator descended smoothly, carrying them away from the chaos above and toward whatever Marco Torino had planned for her survival. What Sophia didn't know, as she watched the floor numbers tick down in silence, was that the man standing beside her was about to discover that all his carefully constructed preferences meant nothing when faced with a woman who challenged every assumption he'd made about attraction, about protection, and about the kind of person worth risking everything to save. The elevator opened into an underground garage where a black sedan waited with its engine running. Marco guided Sophia toward the vehicle with the same efficient urgency he'd shown upstairs, his hand still resting protectively on her lower back. The driver, a compact man with observant eyes, nodded at Marco but said nothing as they climbed into the back seat. Sophia pressed herself against the window as the car pulled away from the hotel, watching the flashing lights of emergency vehicles grow smaller behind them. The reality of what had happened was starting to sink in, making her chest feel tight and her breathing shallow. 3 hours ago, she'd been worried about networking. Now she was fleeing assassins with a stranger who moved through violence like it was familiar territory. The car ride passed in tense silence, winding through Manhattan streets she didn't recognize before eventually stopping in front of a gleaming residential tower that probably cost more per month than she made in a year. Marco led her through a lobby filled with marble and crystal, past a doorman who greeted him by name, and into a private elevator that required a key card to operate. When the elevator doors opened directly into what could only be described as a penthouse, Sophia felt her breath catch. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the city, while the interior was all clean lines and expensive furniture that looked like it belonged in an architecture magazine. Everything from the hardwood floors to the modern art on the walls whispered wealth and taste, the kind of sophisticated luxury she'd only seen in movies. "Welcome to my home," Marco said, his tone neutral as he watched her take in the space. "You'll be safe here until we can resolve the situation." Safe. The word should have been comforting, but standing in Marco's obviously expensive living space, Sophia felt more out of place than ever. She tugged unconsciously at her dress, suddenly aware of how cheaply it must look against the backdrop of Italian leather furniture and designer everything. "The guest room is down the hall," Marco continued, moving toward what looked like a state-of-the-art kitchen. "There are clothes in the closet that should fit you. My housekeeper keeps items for unexpected guests." Sophia wondered what kind of unexpected guests Marco typically entertained, then decided she probably didn't want to know. Everything about this situation felt surreal, like she'd accidentally stepped into someone else's life. "I should call my sister," she said, pulling out her phone. "She'll be worried if I don't come home tonight." Marco's hand covered hers before she could dial, his fingers warm against her skin. "No phone calls until we know who we're dealing with. These people have resources, connections. Any communication could be traced." His touch sent an unexpected jolt of awareness through her, and she found herself noticing details she shouldn't be focusing on. The way his fingers dwarfed hers, the calluses that suggested his hands did more than sign business documents, the gold watch at his wrist that probably cost more than her car. She pulled her hand away, disturbed by her reaction to his proximity. This man was a stranger who dragged her away from a crime scene. She shouldn't be noticing how good he smelled or how his presence seemed to fill the entire room. Marco stepped back, his expression unreadable as he reached for his own phone. "I need to make some calls, arrange additional security. Make yourself comfortable." He disappeared into another room, leaving Sophia alone in the vast living space. She wandered toward the windows, looking out at the glittering city below while trying to process everything that had happened. 6 hours ago, her biggest concern had been impressing potential clients. Now she was hiding from killers in a penthouse that could house 50 people her size. Through the partly open door where Marco had gone, she could hear his voice speaking in what sounded like Italian. His tone was crisp, authoritative, clearly giving orders to whoever was on the other end. Despite everything, she found herself listening to the cadence of his words, the way his accent became more pronounced when he switched languages. Then his words became clear enough for her to understand, and she felt her stomach drop. "No," Marco was saying, his voice carrying clearly now. "I told you my preferences haven't changed. I don't get involved with women who look like they'd rather eat than exercise. This is purely professional." Sophia stepped back from the door as if she'd been burned. There it was, confirmation of what she'd already suspected but hoped wasn't true. To Marco Torino, she was exactly what her former boss had implied. The wrong shape, the wrong size, the wrong everything. She shouldn't care what a stranger thought about her appearance. She'd spent years building walls against exactly this kind of casual cruelty. But something about hearing Marco dismiss her so easily, especially after the way he'd touched her hand with what felt like genuine warmth, made her chest ache with familiar humiliation. Moving quietly toward the guest room he'd mentioned, Sophia tried to focus on practical concerns. She needed to shower, to change clothes, to figure out how long she'd be trapped here with a man who'd made it clear she wasn't his type. Not that she wanted to be his type, she told herself firmly. She had more important things to worry about than the preferences of an arrogant stranger, no matter how compelling his presence or how safe she felt when he stood between her and danger. The guest room was as luxurious as the rest of the penthouse, with a king-sized bed and an ensuite bathroom that featured a shower large enough for 6 people. The closet held an assortment of women's clothing in various sizes, all with designer labels still attached. Sophia found items that would fit her and tried not to think about what kind of lifestyle required keeping a full wardrobe for unexpected female guests. She was reaching for a simple sweater when she heard footsteps in the hallway. Marco appeared in the doorway, having loosened his tie and rolled up his sleeves. The more casual look somehow made him even more attractive, which irritated her given what she'd overheard. Everything you need should be in there, he said. Tomorrow we'll know more about the people who want to eliminate you. Eliminate. Such a clinical word for murder. Sophia turned to face him, noting how his gaze seemed to catalog her appearance again with that same professional assessment. How long do you think I'll need to stay here? She asked. Marco's expression remained neutral, but she caught something that might have been calculation in his dark eyes. Depends on how quickly we can neutralize the threat. These things can take time to resolve properly. The way he said neutralize made her wonder exactly what Marco Torino did for a living that made him so comfortable with violence and luxury in equal measure. She was about to ask when his phone buzzed again. I need to take this, he said, already turning away. Try to get some rest. Tomorrow won't be easy. As his footsteps faded down the hallway, Sophia found herself alone with her thoughts and the uncomfortable realization that her safety depended on a man who'd already made it clear she was everything he didn't want in a woman. She touched her fingers to her lips, remembering the unexpected warmth of his hand covering hers, and wondered why his opinion mattered when her life was literally in danger. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, the city glittered like scattered diamonds, beautiful and remote. Somewhere out there, people wanted her dead simply because she'd been in the wrong place at the wrong time. And here she was, safe in a fortress of glass and steel, protected by a man whose touch made her pulse race even as his words cut deep. Sophia closed her eyes and tried to ignore the voice in her head that whispered this was going to get much more complicated before it got simpler. Sophia woke to the smell of coffee and the soft murmur of Marco's voice somewhere in the penthouse. Sunlight streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the guest room, revealing a view of Manhattan that looked like a postcard. For a moment, she forgot where she was and why, until the events of the previous evening came flooding back with uncomfortable clarity. She found clothes that fit reasonably well, though everything in the closet was clearly expensive and tailored for someone with money to burn. The sweater she chose was cashmere, softer than anything she owned, and the jeans were designer denim that probably cost more than her monthly grocery budget. Following the coffee scent toward the kitchen, Sophia discovered Marco standing at the marble island with his phone pressed to his ear, speaking rapid Italian to someone who sounded agitated on the other end. He'd changed from his formal suit into dark slacks and a white button-down shirt with the sleeves rolled up, revealing strong forearms that suggested he did more than sit behind a desk all day. He noticed her approach and ended his call with what sounded like a sharp command. His dark eyes assessed her appearance in the borrowed clothes, and she felt that familiar flutter of self-consciousness mixed with annoyance at her reaction to his attention. Coffee? He asked, already reaching for a second cup. His housekeeper left ingredients for breakfast before the building went into security lockdown. Security lockdown? Sophia accepted the coffee gratefully, noting that he'd somehow prepared it exactly the way she liked it despite having no way of knowing her preferences. Standard precaution when I have guests who might attract unwanted attention. Marco's tone was matter-of-fact, but she caught the subtle emphasis on unwanted attention that made her stomach twist. Instead of dwelling on the implications, Sophia moved toward the kitchen. Cooking had always been her way of dealing with stress, and right now she needed something familiar and controllable. The kitchen was spectacular, all professional-grade appliances and marble surfaces that would make any chef weep with envy. You don't have to cook, Marco said, watching as she began pulling ingredients from the refrigerator. My people can bring anything you need. I want to, Sophia replied, already feeling calmer as she cracked eggs into a bowl. Besides, you're doing enough by keeping me safe. The least I can do is make breakfast. What she didn't say was that cooking gave her something to focus on besides the way Marco moved through his space with unconscious grace, or how the morning light highlighted the strong line of his jaw. She needed to stop noticing things about him, especially after what she'd overheard the night before. As she whisked eggs and heated a pan, she became aware of Marco watching her with the same intensity he'd shown when assessing threats. But this felt different, less clinical and more personal. When she glanced up, she found his gaze focused on her hands as she worked, then traveling up to her face with something that looked almost like fascination. You're very comfortable in the kitchen, he observed. I like to cook. It relaxes me. Sophia poured the eggs into the pan, adding herbs she'd found in his well-stocked refrigerator. Growing up, My grandmother taught me that food is how you show people you care about them. Marco was quiet for a moment, and when she looked at him again, his expression had shifted to something she couldn't quite read. Your family is close? We were. My parents died in a car accident when I was 22. It's mostly just me and my younger sister now. Sophia flipped the omelet with practiced ease, trying to keep her tone light despite the familiar ache of loss. I'm sorry, Marco said, and the genuine sympathy in his voice caught her off guard. Family is everything. Before she could respond, his phone rang again. This time his conversation was in English, clearly a business call that involved complex logistics and what sounded like significant amounts of money. Sophia tried not to listen, but his voice carried authority that suggested people jumped when Marco Torino spoke. She was plating the omelets when she heard him say something that made her hands still on the plates. The system integration is failing because whoever designed it didn't account for user interface scalability, Marco was saying. We need someone who understands both back-end architecture and front-end optimization. Sophia turned toward him, recognizing the technical problem he was describing. She'd solved similar integration issues for 3 different clients in the past 6 months. Without thinking, she moved closer to where Marco stood with his laptop open on the kitchen island. May I? She asked, gesturing toward the computer screen. Marco looked surprised but stepped aside, ending his call with a promise to resolve the issue within the hour. Sophia studied the technical specifications displayed on his screen, her mind automatically analyzing the code structure and identifying the bottlenecks. Your integration is failing because the API calls aren't properly authenticated, she said, her fingers already moving across the keyboard. You need to restructure the database queries and implement caching for the user interface elements. It should take about 20 minutes to fix. Marco moved to stand beside her, close enough that she could smell his cologne and feel the warmth radiating from his body. She tried to ignore her awareness of his proximity as she worked, but when he leaned in to watch her code modifications, her pulse picked up noticeably. You're a programmer? He asked, his voice closer to her ear than she'd expected. Graphic designer with a computer science degree, Sophia replied, her fingers flying across the keyboard as she implemented the fixes. I freelance because I like solving problems more than office politics. She was vaguely aware of Marco making another phone call, speaking in Italian again, but she was absorbed in the elegant puzzle of making disconnected systems communicate efficiently. When she finally sat back, satisfied with her work, she found Marco watching her with an expression she'd never seen before. That was remarkable, he said quietly. My technical team has been struggling with that integration for weeks. Before Sophia could respond, the elevator chimed, and 2 men emerged into the penthouse. They moved with the same controlled awareness she'd noticed in Marco, clearly associates or employees who were comfortable in his space. The taller man, silver-haired and elegant in an expensive suit, approached the kitchen island with barely concealed curiosity. The younger one, dark-haired and built like a boxer, hung back but studied Sophia with obvious interest. Marco, the older man said in accented English, you said you had a civilian witness to secure. You didn't mention she was so striking. Sophia felt heat rise in her cheeks as both men looked at her with appreciation that felt genuine rather than calculating. Marco's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Sophia, Marco said with obvious reluctance, meet Antonio Benedetti and Luca Romano. They handle security consulting for my business interests. Business interests. Sophia wondered exactly what kind of business required the level of security she'd witnessed, but before she could ask, Antonio was moving toward the laptop. Is this the integration problem you mentioned? He asked, studying the screen. It looks completely different from what our people showed me yesterday. Sophia fixed it, Marco said, and both men turned to look at her with renewed interest. In 20 minutes, Luca added, clearly impressed. Marco, your taste in protective custody subjects has definitely evolved. The comment hung in the air with uncomfortable weight, and Sophia felt something inside her snap. She'd had enough of being discussed like she wasn't standing right there, enough of being categorized and dismissed based on her appearance. Actually, she said, her voice cutting through the suddenly tense silence, I'd like to speak with Marco privately for a moment. Antonio and Luca exchanged glances, clearly recognizing the steel beneath her polite tone. Marco nodded toward the living room, and the two men retreated without argument. When they were alone, Sophia turned to face Marco fully, her hands planted on her hips and her chin raised in challenge. Something about watching him interact with his associates, seeing the respect they showed him and the casual way they'd complimented her competence, had crystallized her anger. "I heard you last night," she said without preamble. "On the phone, talking about women who look like they'd rather eat than exercise. Making it very clear that I'm not your type." Marco went completely still, his dark eyes fixed on her face with an intensity that would have been intimidating if she hadn't been too angry to care. "So let me be clear about something," she continued, her voice steady despite the way her heart was racing. "I don't need your approval or your attraction to validate my worth. I'm good at what I do, I'm intelligent, and I'm stronger than you think. If you want to judge me based on my dress size, that's your limitation, not my problem." Marco took a step closer, and she caught something dangerous in his expression, but she held her ground. "But if I'm going to be trapped here until this threat is resolved," she finished, "I expect to be treated with respect rather than discussed like I'm some inconvenient package you're storing until pickup." For a long moment, Marco said nothing, just studied her face like he was seeing her clearly for the first time. When he finally spoke, his voice was rougher than usual. "You're right," he said quietly. "And I apologize. My comment last night was inappropriate and untrue." "Untrue?" Sophia felt her anger waver slightly at the unexpected admission. Marco stepped closer still, close enough that she had to tip her head back to maintain eye contact. "I said you weren't my type because admitting otherwise would complicate everything about this situation." The air between them seemed to crackle with sudden tension, and Sophia found herself unable to look away from the heat building in his dark eyes. Her anger was transforming into something entirely different, something that made her pulse race for reasons that had nothing to do with confrontation. Marco raised his hand slowly, giving her time to step away if she wanted to, then cupped her cheek with surprising gentleness. His thumb traced across her skin, and she felt her breath catch at the unexpected intimacy of the gesture. "The truth is," he said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper, "you're exactly my type. That's the problem." He was leaning closer, his gaze dropping to her lips, when his phone buzzed with an urgent alert. The spell broke instantly as Marco stepped back, his expression shifting to something cold and professional as he checked the message. "We need to move," he said sharply. "Now." Someone found this location. Before Sophia could process what was happening, Marco was guiding her toward the elevator with the same efficient urgency he'd shown the night before. Behind them, she could hear Antonio and Lucas speaking in rapid Italian, their voices sharp with concern. As the elevator descended toward the garage, Sophia realized that whatever had been building between her and Marco would have to wait. Once again, danger had found them, and survival took precedence over everything else. But she couldn't forget the way he'd looked at her in those last moments before the alert, or the rough honesty in his voice when he'd admitted she was exactly what he wanted. Whatever happened next, she knew everything between them had just shifted into territory neither of them had expected to navigate. The safe house Marco brought her to this time was different from his penthouse. Smaller, more intimate, tucked away in what looked like a converted brownstone in a quiet neighborhood she didn't recognize. The living space felt more personal somehow, with family photographs on the mantel and books scattered on side tables like someone actually lived here rather than just used it for business. Sophia sank onto the leather sofa, her hands still shaking slightly from their narrow escape. The attackers had reached Marco's building just minutes after they'd left through the underground garage, and she'd seen the smoke rising from what she assumed was an explosion as they drove away. The reality that people were willing to destroy an entire building to get to her was still sinking in. "Let me see your arm," Marco said, settling beside her on the couch with a first aid kit. During their hurried exit, she'd scraped her elbow against a concrete pillar, and though it was minor, Marco's expression suggested he took any injury to her personally. "It's just a scratch," Sophia protested, but she let him roll up her sleeve anyway. His touch was gentle as he cleaned the scrape with antiseptic, his dark brows drawn together in concentration. "I should have been more careful," he said quietly, his fingers featherlight as he applied antibiotic ointment. This never should have happened. There was something in his tone that made her study his face more carefully. The man who'd commanded respect from dangerous associates, who'd moved through violence like it was choreographed, looked genuinely distressed about a minor scrape on her elbow. "Marco," she said softly, "this isn't your fault. You saved my life. Multiple times now." He finished bandaging her arm, but didn't move away, his hands still resting gently on her forearm. When he looked up at her, she saw something vulnerable in his dark eyes, something that didn't match the controlled confidence he usually projected. "I don't usually get personally involved," he said, his voice rougher than usual. "I handle security consultations, business arrangements. I don't protect civilians who have nowhere else to go." "But you're protecting me," Sophia pointed out. "Yes," Marco said simply. "And that's the problem." Before she could ask what he meant, he was moving away from her, running his hands through his dark hair in a gesture that suggested frustration. The late afternoon light streaming through the windows highlighted the tension in his shoulders, the way he held himself like he was fighting some internal battle. "You asked me last night what I do for a living," he said, not looking at her. "I run a security consulting firm, but it's not the kind of business you advertise in yellow pages. My clients are people who have enemies, who need problems solved quietly and efficiently." Sophia felt her stomach tighten as pieces began falling into place. The wealth, the automatic deference from other people, the way he moved through violence like it was familiar territory. "I see," she said carefully. Marco turned back to her then, his expression intense. "My father built our family business on the principle that reputation is everything. You honor your commitments, you protect what's yours, and you never show weakness. I learned early that people will use any vulnerability against you if they can." He moved to the window, looking out at the quiet street like he was checking for threats, but Sophia sensed he needed the distance more than the security assessment. "When I was younger, I made the mistake of believing that women were interested in me rather than what I could provide for them," he continued. "Expensive dinners, designer clothes, vacations to places they could post about on social media. It took me longer than it should have to realize they saw me as a means to an end." Sophia felt something twist in her chest at the pain carefully hidden beneath his matter-of-fact tone. "How long?" she asked gently. "Long enough to build very specific preferences about the kind of woman I got involved with," Marco replied with bitter humor. "Beautiful, but not too ambitious. Sophisticated, but not too intelligent. The kind of woman who would appreciate what I offered without wanting to understand how I earned it. The kind of woman I'm not," Sophia said, understanding flooding through her. Marco turned from the window then, his gaze finding hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Exactly," he said quietly. "You're everything I trained myself not to want." The confession hung between them, heavy with implications Sophia wasn't sure she was ready to examine. Part of her wanted to ask what had changed, what made her different from his usual type beyond the obvious. But another part of her, the part that had spent years building walls against exactly this kind of rejection, warned her to be careful. Instead, she found herself sharing something she rarely talked about. "I know what it's like to have people see only what they want to see," she said, her fingers absently tracing the bandage on her elbow. "Growing up, I was always the chubby girl who tried too hard to fit in. Kids can be cruel about things that make you different." Marco moved back toward the couch, settling beside her again, but leaving careful space between them. "In college, I lost weight trying to become someone I thought would be more acceptable," Sophia continued. "I dated guys who seemed interested until someone thinner came along. By the time I graduated, I'd learned that most people saw my body as either a flaw to overlook or a novelty to experience temporarily." She realized Marco was listening with complete attention, his dark eyes focused on her face like her words mattered more than anything else in the world. "So I built walls too," she said softly. "I focused on my career, on being competent and independent. I told myself I didn't need anyone's approval or attraction to be complete." "But you do want it," Marco said, not a question. Sophia met his gaze directly, feeling exposed but oddly safe at the same time. "Yes," she admitted. "I want someone to see all of me and choose me anyway. Not despite my curves or because of them, but because of everything I am." Marco was quiet for a long moment, his gaze dropping to her mouth, then back to her eyes. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "When I watched you this morning, cooking in my kitchen like you belonged there, solving problems my technical team couldn't handle, standing up to me when I'd been disrespectful," he paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "I realized my preferences had nothing to do with what I actually wanted." "What do you want?" Sophia asked, surprised by her own boldness. Marco's hand came up to cup her cheek, his thumb tracing across her skin with the same gentleness he'd shown while tending her scrape. You, he said simply. Exactly as you are. The space between them seemed to disappear as Marco leaned closer, his gaze dropping to her lips, then back to her eyes, giving her time to pull away if she wanted to. But Sophia found herself leaning into him instead, her heart racing as his mouth finally touched hers. The kiss was nothing like she'd expected. Soft and searching at first, like he was asking permission for something precious. When she responded, pressing closer and sliding her hands into his dark hair, Marco deepened the kiss with a gentleness that made her chest ache with unexpected emotion. When they finally broke apart, Marco rested his forehead against hers, both of them breathing unsteadily. This changes everything, he said quietly. Before Sophia could ask what he meant, the sound of a key in the front door made them spring apart. Marco's hand moved automatically toward his jacket, clearly reaching for a weapon, but he relaxed when an elegant woman in her early 60s entered the living room. Marco, Caro, the woman said in accented English, moving toward them with the kind of confident grace that suggested she was used to being welcome wherever she went. Mama, Marco said, standing to embrace the woman. What are you doing here? I brought dinner, she replied, holding up several bags that smelled incredible. And I wanted to meet the woman who has my son so distracted he forgets to call his mother back. Marco's jaw tightened slightly, but he turned towards Sophia with obvious resignation. Sophia, meet my mother, Isabella Torino. Mama, this is Sophia Martinez. Isabella studied Sophia with sharp, dark eyes that missed nothing, from her borrowed designer clothes to the careful way she held herself. Then, unexpectedly, the older woman smiled with genuine warmth. Finally, she said, moving to take Sophia's hands in both of hers. A woman with substance. I was beginning to think my son would never develop better taste. Mama, Marco warned, but there was affection beneath his exasperation. What? Isabella asked innocently. Those skinny girls you used to bring around looked like they would blow away in a strong wind. This one looks like she could keep up with you. Over dinner, which was the best Italian food Sophia had ever tasted, Isabella regaled them with stories from Marco's childhood while subtly interrogating Sophia about her background, her family, her goals. But it didn't feel invasive. Isabella asked questions like someone who was genuinely interested in the answers rather than looking for ammunition. You have beautiful hands, Isabella observed as Sophia helped clear the dishes. An artist's hands. Marco told me you're very talented with computers. I like solving puzzles, Sophia replied, finding elegant solutions to complicated problems. Like my son, Isabella said with a meaningful look toward Marco. He has always been attracted to complicated problems that need fixing. After Isabella left with promises to return soon with more food, Marco and Sophia found themselves alone again. The comfortable domesticity of the evening, sharing a meal with his mother like they were a real couple, had created an intimacy that felt both natural and dangerous. Your mother is wonderful, Sophia said as they finished cleaning up. She likes you, Marco replied. She's not usually so welcoming to women I bring around. Do you bring many women around? Sophia asked, then immediately regretted the question when she saw something flicker across Marco's expression. No, he said quietly. I haven't brought anyone to meet my mother in over 3 years. And never anyone who mattered. The word mattered hung between them, loaded with implications that made Sophia's pulse race. Before she could respond, Marco's phone buzzed with what looked like an urgent message. His expression darkened as he read, and Sophia felt cold dread settle in her stomach. What is it? She asked. Marco looked up from his phone, his face grim. They know you're important to me now. The people hunting you have shifted tactics. This is no longer about eliminating a witness. What does that mean? It means, Marco said, moving toward her with sudden urgency, that keeping you safe just became personal for them too. They'll use you to get to me, which makes you infinitely more valuable as a target. As if to emphasize his point, the lights in the safe house suddenly went out, plunging them into darkness. In the silence that followed, Sophia heard Marco curse softly in Italian before his hand found hers in the dark. Stay close to me, he whispered against her ear. And whatever happens, remember that I will not let them take you. The tenderness they'd shared over dinner felt like a lifetime ago as danger closed in around them once again. But this time, Sophia realized with a mixture of fear and something that might have been hope, she wasn't just a random witness anymore. She was someone worth protecting, someone who mattered to a man who didn't let many people matter at all. The power came back on after 20 tense minutes, revealing that the outage had been a probe rather than an attack. Marco's security team swept the area and found evidence of surveillance, but no immediate threat. Still, the message was clear. They were being watched, studied, and the enemy was planning something bigger. That night, as Sophia lay in the guest room staring at the ceiling, she couldn't stop thinking about the kiss they'd shared or the way Marco had looked at her when he said she mattered. Every time she closed her eyes, she could feel his hands cradling her face, the gentle pressure of his mouth against hers, the way he'd whispered her name like it was something precious. She was still awake when she heard soft footsteps in the hallway outside her door. A gentle knock made her heart race. "Can't sleep either?" Marco's voice was barely above a whisper. Sophia sat up in bed, pulling the borrowed silk nightgown around her shoulders. "No," she admitted. "Too much to process." When she opened the door, she found Marco leaning against the frame, his hair slightly messed and his white dress shirt unbuttoned at the collar. The vulnerability in his dark eyes matched what she'd been feeling, a raw honesty that made her chest tight with emotion. "I keep thinking about what you said earlier," he said quietly, "about wanting someone to see all of you and choose you anyway." Sophia's breath caught as he stepped closer, close enough that she could smell his cologne and feel the warmth radiating from his body. "I see you, Sophia," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Everything about you. Your strength, your intelligence, the way you stand up for yourself when someone tries to diminish you. The way you care for people, how you made my kitchen feel like home." His hands came up to frame her face, thumbs tracing across her cheekbones with infinite gentleness. "And you're beautiful," he continued, his gaze traveling from her eyes to her mouth and back again. "Not despite anything, not because of anything except exactly who you are." When he kissed her this time, there was nothing hesitant about it. Sophia melted into him, her hands fisting in his shirt as he deepened the kiss with a passion that made her knees weak. She could feel his heart racing against her chest, could taste the coffee he'd been drinking, and something uniquely him that made her want more. They moved together toward her bed, Marco's hands sliding into her hair as he whispered words in Italian against her lips that sounded like prayers. When he laid her down on the soft mattress, his touch was reverent, worshipful, like she was something infinitely precious that he'd been given permission to treasure. "You're perfect," he whispered against her throat, his lips tracing patterns across her skin that made her arch beneath him. "Absolutely perfect." In the soft lamplight, Marco showed her exactly how beautiful he found every curve, every soft line of her body, his hands and mouth worshiping her with a devotion that erased years of insecurity and doubt. When he told her she was gorgeous, stunning, everything he'd ever wanted, she believed him because she could see the truth in his eyes, could feel it in the way he touched her like she was made of spun gold. Afterward, as they lay wrapped together in the tangled sheets, Sophia felt transformed. Not because of what they'd done, but because of how Marco had made her feel while they did it. Cherished, desired, perfect exactly as she was. "I love you," Marco said against her hair, his voice quiet but sure. "I know it's too soon. I know this situation is insane, but I love you, Sophia." "I love you too," she whispered back, surprised by how natural the words felt, how right they sounded in the intimate darkness. They woke the next morning wrapped around each other like they'd been sleeping together for years. Marco made coffee while Sophia showered, and when she emerged wearing one of his shirts over her jeans, he pulled her against his chest and kissed her forehead like they were already married. The domestic intimacy felt natural, comfortable, like they'd found something neither of them had realized they were searching for. Even when Antonio and Luca arrived for a security briefing, there was an ease between her and Marco that hadn't existed before, a sense of belonging that went deeper than mere attraction. "Good morning, Mrs. Torino," Luca said with a grin that suggested he'd noticed the change in dynamics immediately. "Not yet," Sophia replied, but she didn't protest the assumption, and Marco's arm tightened around her waist in a way that suggested he liked the sound of it. Over the next few days, Marco brought her deeper into his world. She met his key associates, attended business dinners where her technical expertise proved valuable, and gradually understood that Marco's security consulting firm was legitimate even if some of his clients operated in moral gray areas. What surprised her was how easily she fit into his life. His business associates treated her with genuine respect, clearly recognizing that she wasn't just another pretty distraction, but someone Marco valued for her intelligence and competence. When she solved another complex technical problem during a client meeting, saving them thousands of dollars and hours of work, Marco introduced her afterward as his partner in ways that went beyond business. At his cousin's wedding that weekend, Marco kept his hand on her back as they moved through the crowd of elegantly dressed relatives. When his aunt commented that she'd never seen him so happy, he pulled Sophia closer and said she was the reason for everything good in his life lately. "You've changed," Isabella told Sophia during the reception as they watched Marco laugh at something his nephew was telling him. "He smiles now. Really smiles, not just that polite expression he uses for business." Sophia felt a warm glow settle in her chest as she watched the man she loved interact with his family. The dangerous, controlled businessman was still there, but so was someone softer, more open, someone who touched her hand during conversation and looked at her like she was the best thing that had ever happened to him. Her confidence had transformed over the past week. She carried herself differently now, dressed in clothes Marco had bought for her not to change her, but to show off what he loved about her exactly as she was. When other women at the wedding looked at her with obvious curiosity about how she'd captured Marco Torino's attention, she felt secure enough to smile back rather than shrinking away. After the wedding, as they danced to slow music under string lights in the garden, Marco spun her gently, then pulled her close against his chest. "Marry me," he said against her ear, his voice serious despite the romantic setting. Sophia pulled back to look at his face, searching for any hint that he was joking. What she found was complete sincerity and a love so deep it took her breath away. "Marco," she started, but he placed a finger gently against her lips. "I know it's fast. I know this whole situation is complicated, but I've never been more certain of anything in my life," he said. "I want you to be my wife, my partner in everything. I want to build a life with you." Before Sophia could answer, Marco's phone buzzed with an urgent alert. The romantic spell broke as his expression shifted to something cold and dangerous. "What is it?" Sophia asked, though she could already tell from his face that it was bad. Marco's jaw clenched as he read the message. "They took your sister." The words hit Sophia like a physical blow. "Lily? No, that's impossible. She's at college. She's safe." Marco showed her the phone screen, and Sophia felt the world tilt sideways. The message contained a photo of her 18-year-old sister bound and gagged in what looked like a warehouse, along with an address and a simple demand: "Come alone or she dies." "This is my fault," Marco said, his voice tight with rage and guilt. "They're using her to get to you because they know you matter to me." Sophia was already moving toward the exit, her mind focused on only one thing. "We have to go get her. Now." Marco caught her arm gently but firmly. "Not we. This is a trap designed specifically for you. If you walk into that warehouse, you'll both be dead within minutes." "Then what do you suggest?" Sophia demanded, fear for her sister overriding everything else. "She's my family, Marco. She's all I have left." "We do this smart," Marco replied, already pulling out his phone to make calls. "My team, proper backup, surveillance. We get her back safely, but we don't hand them exactly what they want." But as they rushed toward the car, Sophia made a decision that she didn't share with Marco. Lily was in danger because of her, and no amount of strategy would change the fact that the people holding her sister wanted Sophia specifically. Whatever the risks, whatever it took, she wasn't going to let her little sister pay the price for falling in love with Marco Torino. The last week had taught her that she was stronger than she'd ever realized, that she was worth protecting and loving and fighting for. Now it was time to prove that the people she loved were worth the same fierce devotion. Even if it meant walking into a trap designed to destroy everything she'd just discovered was worth living for. The warehouse district was deserted at midnight, exactly as the kidnappers had planned. Marco's team had positioned themselves strategically around the building, but Sophia knew that no amount of preparation would matter if the people inside decided to hurt Lily before they could act. Against Marco's explicit instructions, Sophia had insisted on being part of the rescue operation. The argument in the car had been heated but brief. Her sister was inside that building because of her, and she wasn't going to hide behind protective walls while Lily's life hung in the balance. You stay behind me at all times, Marco had finally agreed, his jaw tight with worry. You do exactly what I say when I say it. Promise me, Sophia. She'd promised, though they both knew she'd break that promise if it meant saving her sister. Now, as they approached the warehouse through the shadows, Sophia felt the same fierce determination that had carried her through the past week. She wasn't the same woman who'd hidden behind cocktail tables at networking events. She was someone who fought for the people she loved, someone who didn't back down when things got dangerous. Marco moved with deadly precision, his weapon drawn and his attention focused on every shadow, every potential threat. But when he glanced back at her, his eyes held something beyond professional concern. He was terrified of losing her, and that knowledge gave Sophia strength rather than fear. They entered the building through a side entrance Antonio had identified as unguarded. The interior was exactly what Sophia had expected from the photograph. Concrete floors, exposed beams, and the kind of echoing emptiness that made every sound seem amplified. Marco signaled for her to stop as voices became audible from the center of the warehouse. 3 men, speaking in what sounded like a mixture of Italian and English, discussing their plans for when Sophia arrived. She's just bait anyway, one of them was saying. Once Torino shows up to play hero, we eliminate both of them and send a message to anyone else who thinks they can interfere with our operations. Sophia felt cold rage settle in her chest at the casual way they discussed murdering her and Marco. These people had terrorized her, destroyed his penthouse, kidnapped her innocent sister, all because they wanted to hurt the man she loved. Marco caught her eye and pointed toward a stack of shipping containers that would give them a better view of the situation. As they moved carefully through the shadows, Sophia caught her first glimpse of Lily. Her 18-year-old sister was tied to a chair in the center of the open space, her dark hair messy and her college sweatshirt torn. But her chin was raised defiantly, and even from a distance Sophia could see the Martinez family stubbornness in every line of her posture. Lily was scared but not broken, angry rather than defeated. 2 men stood guard near her while a third paced back and forth, clearly the leader of this operation. All 3 were armed, professional, and positioned so they could see the main entrances to the warehouse. Marco spoke quietly into his radio, coordinating with his team outside. The plan was simple: create enough distraction to get Lily to safety while eliminating the threat permanently. No negotiations, no halfway measures. These people had made the mistake of targeting Marco's family, and he didn't forgive that kind of error in judgment. On my signal, Marco whispered to Sophia, "You get to your sister and get her out of that chair. I'll handle the rest." "What if something goes wrong?" Sophia asked, though she was already moving toward the position he'd indicated. Marco's hand caught hers for just a moment, his fingers squeezing gently. "Nothing will go wrong," he said with absolute conviction. "I have too much to live for now to let anything go wrong." The next few minutes unfolded with choreographed precision. Marco's team created diversions at 2 different entrances, while Marco himself moved like a shadow through the warehouse. Sophia had never seen him in action like this, deadly and efficient, eliminating threats with the kind of cold professionalism that reminded her exactly how dangerous her mild-mannered businessman really was. When the shooting started, Sophia was already running toward Lily, her heart pounding as she worked to untie the ropes that held her sister to the chair. Lily's eyes were wide with fear and confusion, but she held still as Sophia's fingers worked frantically at the knots. "Sophie?" Lily whispered. "What's happening? Who are these people?" "It's okay, baby," Sophia said, finally getting the ropes loose enough to pull Lily free. "We're getting you out of here." Behind them, she could hear Marco's voice giving sharp commands in Italian, the sound of footsteps and returned gunfire, the organized chaos of a plan being executed flawlessly. When she looked back, she saw Marco moving toward them with Antonio and Luca flanking him, the 3 kidnappers nowhere to be seen. "Is it over?" Sophia asked as Marco reached them. "It's over," Marco confirmed, pulling both sisters against his chest in a fierce embrace. His hands shook slightly as he held them, and Sophia realized how terrified he'd been despite his outward calm. The next hour passed in a blur of police statements, paramedic checks, and phone calls to arrange secure transportation. Marco's connections ensured that the official reports would reflect a kidnapping resolved by private security rather than the more complicated truth about organized crime rivalries. As dawn broke over the city, they sat in Marco's car outside Lily's college dormitory. Her sister was physically unharmed but emotionally shaken, clinging to Sophia like she was afraid to let her go. "I'm sorry, Lily," Sophia said for the 10th time. "This never should have happened to you." "Are you kidding?" Lily replied with a shaky laugh. "My sister is dating someone so badass that people kidnap me to get to him. This is the most excitement I've had all semester." Despite everything, Sophia found herself laughing too. Only Lily would find a way to see adventure in what had been the most terrifying night of their lives. As they walked Lily up to her room, Marco stayed close but gave the sisters space to process everything that had happened. When Lily hugged him goodbye, she whispered something in his ear that made him smile genuinely for the first time since receiving the kidnapping message. "What did she say?" Sophia asked as they drove away from the campus. "She said if I hurt you, she knows where I live and she's not afraid to use it against me." Marco's tone was amused, but his expression was tender. "I told her I had no intention of hurting you ever, because I'm planning to marry you as soon as possible." Sophia felt her breath catch. "About that proposal," she said carefully. Marco pulled the car over to the side of the road and turned to face her fully. In the morning light, she could see the exhaustion around his eyes, the strain of the past 12 hours, but also something deeper. A love so complete and unwavering that it took her breath away. "I know this week has been insane," he said quietly. "I know we've been thrown together by circumstances that neither of us chose. But what I feel for you isn't circumstantial, Sophia. It's not gratitude or proximity or adrenaline." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a small velvet box that made her heart stop entirely. "I love everything about you," Marco continued, opening the box to reveal a ring that was absolutely perfect. Simple, elegant, with a center diamond surrounded by smaller stones that caught the morning light like stars. "I love your strength, your intelligence, your compassion. I love the way you stand up for yourself and the people you care about. I love how you make my world feel bigger and better and more meaningful than I ever thought possible." Sophia stared at the ring, then at Marco's face, seeing nothing but sincerity and devotion in his dark eyes. "I want to build a life with you," he said. "I want to wake up next to you for the next 50 years. I want to watch you solve impossible problems and argue with me when you think I'm wrong. I want to have children with you and watch them inherit your brilliant mind and your beautiful heart." "Yes," Sophia whispered, tears streaming down her face. "Yes, I'll marry you." Marco's hands shook slightly as he slipped the ring onto her finger, and when he kissed her, it tasted like promises and forever and the kind of happiness she'd never believed she deserved. 8 months later, Sophia stood in the bridal suite of the same hotel where they'd first met, adjusting her wedding dress in the mirror. The gown was perfect, custom designed to showcase rather than hide her curves, making her feel like the most beautiful woman in the world. "Ready?" Isabella asked, appearing in the doorway with tears of joy in her eyes. Marco was pacing so much I'm afraid he'll wear a hole in the marble. Sophia took one last look at herself in the mirror, hardly recognizing the confident, radiant woman looking back at her. 8 months ago, she'd been hiding in corners, convinced she didn't belong in rooms full of successful people. Now she was about to marry the most incredible man she'd ever met, surrounded by family and friends who loved and respected her exactly as she was. The ceremony was small but perfect, held in the hotel's garden with white flowers and string lights that made everything look like a fairy tale. When Marco saw her walking down the aisle, his composure cracked entirely, tears streaming down his face as he mouthed "You're beautiful" at her. The vows they'd written were personal, honest, full of promises about partnership and support and loving each other through whatever challenges life brought. When the officiant pronounced them husband and wife, Marco kissed her with such joy and reverence that the gathered guests burst into spontaneous applause. At the reception, Sophia watched her husband, work the room with easy confidence, introducing her to business associates and family friends as his brilliant, beautiful wife. Every introduction carried such obvious pride and love that she felt like she was glowing from the inside out. "Can I share something with you?" Sophia asked the small group of women who'd gathered around her during a quiet moment at the reception. "I want to know if any of you have ever felt like you weren't enough, like you needed to change yourself to be worthy of love." Several women nodded. clearly recognizing the feeling she was describing. 6 months ago, I would have told you that men like Marco don't fall in love with women like me, Sophia continued. I would have believed that I needed to be smaller, different, less than what I am to deserve someone's devotion. But the truth is, the right person doesn't want you to be less. They want all of you, exactly as you are, and they make you feel like the most beautiful, most worthy, most perfect version of yourself. She glanced across the room at Marco, who was watching her with such obvious adoration that several guests had noticed and were smiling. True love doesn't ask you to shrink, she said softly. It asks you to shine. As the evening wound down, Marco found her on the hotel's terrace, looking out at the city lights that twinkled like stars below them. Mrs. Torino, he said, wrapping his arms around her from behind. How does it feel to be married to a man who was completely wrong about his type? Sophia leaned back against his chest, feeling absolutely perfect in his embrace. Like the best kind of surprise, she replied. How does it feel to be married to a woman who proved all your assumptions wrong? Marco turned her in his arms so he could look at her face, his expression tender and amazed. Like the luckiest man alive, he said simply. The next morning, as they prepared to leave for their honeymoon in Sicily, Marco's business associate approached him at the hotel breakfast restaurant. So Torino, the man said with obvious curiosity, I have to ask, what changed your mind about your preferences? You always said you'd never settle down with anyone who didn't fit your very specific criteria. Marco looked across the restaurant at Sophia, who was saying goodbye to Lily and making sure her sister had everything she needed for the upcoming semester. Even in casual travel clothes, his wife was radiant, confident, absolutely beautiful in ways that had nothing to do with fitting anyone else's narrow definitions. I realized my criteria were wrong, Marco replied, not taking his eyes off the woman he loved. I thought I knew what I wanted, but I was measuring against the wrong things. Beauty, intelligence, strength, kindness, the ability to challenge me and support me and make me better than I am. Those things don't come in one specific package. Sophia caught his eye across the room and smiled, the kind of smile that still made his heart race even after months of marriage. When she walked toward him, every man in the restaurant noticed her confidence, her grace, the way she moved like she owned every room she entered. The right woman isn't about fitting some predetermined mold, Marco concluded as Sophia reached his side and slipped her hand into his. The right woman is the one who makes you realize all your previous standards were just limitations you placed on your own happiness. As they left the hotel together, Sophia reflected on how much her life had changed since that terrifying night when gunshots had shattered her quiet existence. She'd found love, strength, confidence, and a partner who saw her worth in ways she'd never imagined possible. Most importantly, she'd learned that she was enough, exactly as she was, worthy of protection and devotion and the kind of love that transformed everything it touched. And as Marco squeezed her hand and told her he couldn't wait to start their real life together, Sophia knew that sometimes the most beautiful things came from the most unexpected places.